Thank you very much, Doug, for that few words there. That's flattering, we'll see. But also thank you for inviting me here. And I guess we'll just go ahead here. I'm going to talk a little bit about, following up some what Doug's said and what some of the things that we've heard about recently is how agriculture management, and especially phosphorus, which is my area of interest, how that impacts water quality. And something I've, since moving from ARS USDA to the university in Arkansas, becoming more applied and working with farmers and how we transfer that. And you know, both have alluded to that already about the science and making it relevant, not just to other scientists, but to farmers. So I'm going to touch on that. So what I want to talk about a little bit is just the brief history of our relationship with phosphorus. Where are the sources, how it's transported. Some of you probably aware, some of you may not, so excuse those that do know, but I will want to just touch on that briefly. And a few healthy thoughts about where we are and where we're going, and some of the legacies, and how we relay all this information and empowering farmers, at least where we are in Arkansas. And so one of the things that has just kind of come about is that Henning Brandt discovered phosphorus. He's an alchemist in 1669. And he was looking for the philosopher's stone and actually found it in urine. And we're still trying to extract phosphorus from urine, and still these days, that's a long time. Things sometimes don't change that much. The name phosphorus comes from the Greek word of phos, which is light, and phoros, which is bearer. So it's the bearer of light. And I think one of the transformational changes, if you look at some of the history of phosphorus, it was in using red phosphorus for matches and the light. And so it's a bearer of light. But it's also widely used, organophosphorus, in many different uses that some of us be aware and some of us may not be. It's also a product. White phosphorus is not very pleasant. So there's a mixed history of phosphorus. And that's why sometimes it's called the devil's element. Next year is going to be the 350th anniversary of the discovery of phosphorus. And that 350 keeps coming back up because now USGS are saying there's about 350 more years of what we know, the resources of phosphorus that are left to mine. And that was kind of transformational in terms of phosphorus, that it was a sudden realization. The length of time has varied, but there is a undisputable fact that it is a finite resource, and when we run out, we cannot manufacture it. And so that's kind of changed the metric a little bit in terms of sustainability. But while we hear about, Lake Erie, Chesapeake, and all the other areas around the world with phosphorus being a problem in the US, there's still probably the majority of soils still require phosphorus for productive agriculture. These excesses are localized. And in many cases, we'll talk about it, it's not bad management. It's just some of the recommendations that at the time were felt that was appropriate. Manure applications based on nitrogen rather than phosphorus. But the point is, there still is a need for phosphorus fertilizer applications for productive agriculture. So part of the problem is a little bit of phosphorus goes a long way. I think what Lake Erie's seeing, maybe 1 kilogram or less, it can cause algal problems. That is a really small percentage amount of what we're using in agriculture, and there's probably an order of magnitude difference between what we're trying to get in the soil in terms of what's crop needs, critical level in soil, as to what is a critical level in water. Is an order of magnitude greater. And so there's, again, this idea that a little bit goes a long way, and systems are leaky inherently. And so this is the process of phosphorus, for those that are not familiar. It's basically a surface process, although we're finding some movement now through soils under certain conditions in tiles or micropores. But generally about 5% of what we put on is lost in runoff. And that has been part of the dialogue behind where we've got, because that really is not an economic loss to a farmer. Why should they be worried about that if there was no other pressures put upon them? That it's not an economic loss. Also, there's about 80%, and again, this varies from soil to soil. Clay soils absorb more, sandy soils absorb less. But the point is, a lot of what we apply in fertilizer or manure is bound to the soil in forms that are not available to a plant. Therefore, we need to apply more in subsequent years. We've got soil testing procedures that help farmers identify that. And there's about a 15% offtake in crops. These are just ballpark general ideas just to show you where this phosphorus ends up and why we are getting into the situation where we are now. And so part of the work that we did back in the early 2000 was to look at critical source areas. And Doug mentioned about teams, and I'd be fortunate, and I probably wouldn't be standing here now if I wasn't working with other teams of people, hydrologists, physicists, and chemists. So it is teamwork. And what we were able to do with some field work was to show that, and it's basic common sense, that phosphorus isn't a problem unless it moves with runoff. So it's the idea that you've got to have some form of transport, whether it's surface runoff or infiltration, for phosphorus to be an issue. And so EPA at one time were looking at trying to dictate, well, soil phosphorus is going to be the metric which we're going to determine whether a farmer can and can't apply anymore. And we said, no, if you're looking at this from an environmental perspective, you've got to include hydrology. And the idea is that where there's a high source, that's where you've been maybe applying manure or fertilizer, or it's built up in the soil, and there is a high transport, and that might be a slope factor, or it might be a soil type factor. Where these two intersect, you get these critical source areas. And these are generally about 20%. Again, that's an average figure, but it comes back time and time again. It's not the same area in every watershed. All watersheds are different. But generally, the majority of phosphorus tends to come from a small area of the landscape. And so once we had been able to show that with some field work, it changed EPA and NRCS's dialogue towards critical source area management, or precision agriculture, or precision conservation. And it also led to the 590 standard, including the risk of phosphorus rather than just how much was being applied. And so now every state basically in the US does have some form of a phosphorus index that dictates, or at least allows farmers as part of their 590 requirements to determine how much they could apply. And that's based on the risk of loss as well as how much is in the soil. So that's kind of a backdrop here. So what are some of the conservation? I'm just going to go through a few of the conservation measures because there's a reason how we'll discuss this later, but we split them up again into source and transport. And the sources are basically trying to manage that phosphorus on the field so it doesn't become above crop needs, or it doesn't become an issue. And so we've got the IP&I, or the other, at least the buzzwords of 4R, right place, right time. It's the management of that phosphorus, applying the right amounts based on soil testing. That's critical. Soil testing and manure testing. In Arkansas, we require, before manure is applied, to manage, or at least measure, how much phosphorus is in that manure, how much water-soluble phosphorus is in that manure, because we showed that that was a good indicator of how much that phosphorus could run off in water. So mainly where we are, we've got poultry litter, but they do, as part of that 590, they do measure how much, because believe it or not, all manures are not created the same. And there's some of the work that's done in Pennsylvania, and I'm sure it's more broadly now, is application below the ground or injection of fertilizer where it is possible, or manure, to get it below the surface, because we showed in that first slide of the processes back there that mainly it's the top 2 inches, 5 inches of soil where that phosphorus resides. If you can get it below that, then the risk of runoff occurring and transporting it is reduced dramatically. And then there's the transport. And so these conservation practices or best management practices revolve around trying to minimize how much runoff there is or how much erosion there is. And the two other popular ones right now are conservation tillage and also cover crops. NRCS are promoting cover crops very widely. Part of the issue, I think, with cover crops is how you manage that cover crop, and a lot of that is dependent on farmer-to-farmer taste and what suits them best. And again, it's one of these things that there's no black and white, this is how it has to be done. But both of those practices tend to cover the soil with some vegetation which protect it like a blanket, and so you get less runoff, you get less erosion, and movement of especially phosphorus. Rotational grazing, we've got a lot of grazing in our area where we have poultry integrators. We've got 2 billion chickens grown within a 2-county area of northwest Arkansas. There's a synergy between the poultry and the beef grazers. That's a free source of fertilizer. It not only provides nutrients, it also provides organic matter, and so the soil health tends to improve. But overgrazing can be an issue, and there's a lot more now looking at rotational grazing. It takes more management, so it's not for everybody, but you don't overgraze and create a larger problem. Riparian buffers are well known, well established, filter of runoff as it enters a stream. And then finally, stream bank erosion. We see a lot of that in different areas, and maybe some of it's climate driven, but banks erode well, and it is really difficult to remediate those banks. It's very expensive. Unlike a lot of BMPs or conservation practices, it's better to implement these at the beginning than try and play catch up, because it gets more and more expensive. So stream bank fencing is a real practice that will help reduce erosion. However, putting fencing along the stream is not always the easiest thing to do for a farmer. It's costly, you have to inspect it, it takes land out of production. So again, like a lot of things, it depends on the farmer and what they feel they're comfortable with doing and what works for them. And so I just want to make this healthy thought, this idea, this analogy. We've done a lot of work with a SEEP program, Conservation Effects Assessment Program, several years ago, which did some synthesis of programs that NIFA and USDA had funding 13 critical watersheds, and then there was some land grant watersheds that were also. But they looked at conservation practices and how effective they have been. Because Congress and the Farm Bill are looking at, if you can't show us that these practices are working and are effective, we're not going to give you any more money. You've got to show us that what we're investing this money is actually working. And that really led to this type of work. But one of the things that SEEP program did see, that a lot of times these conservation practices may not be working. And I think it's part of this idea that we need to look at conservation as a fact that it's not everything works. It's not this, it's going to be a panacea, it's going to alleviate all of our problems, and we need to make that aware to farmers. There are side effects, which I'll touch on. So we should treat it like human health in a way. We've got a lot of, half of the packaging or 2/3 of the packaging on over-the-counter drugs are the side effects, and we're all aware of that. We probably don't read it all, but they're there, and we really don't pay attention to that in terms of conservation practices. And so the analogy is that we really need to assess that site or that watershed or that area to comprehensively determine what the issue is. Is it runoff or is it leaching? You've got different conservation practices, and sometimes the effort wasn't put into determining what the real problem might have been. Is it particular or is it soluble losses? Again, it's different conservation practices would be needed to treat one or the other. Is it infield or is it stream? We now know that there's a lot of fluvial phosphorus embedded in streams, in banks, in lakes, and that farmers have reduced losses from their fields. And so there's this legacy phosphorus. And so it's not going to be as effective in putting a lot of infield practices if a lot of the nutrients are coming from the stream once it's already left that field. You've got to make sure that remedy works and address the benefits and also the trade-offs. So it's a philosophy that I think that we need to be embracing in terms of how we look at conservation practices. We don't just say, this practice is going to solve the problem, that's a quick fix, and I think sometimes that's an easy fix which may not work. And a lot of times, extension or NRCS may suggest those, and when it doesn't work, our credibility with those farmers is harmed, and we need to be aware of that, and we need to limit that. And so some of these are just legacies here, the different process. It takes a long time for phosphorus to be mined out of soils once it's built up. So it builds up quicker than you can bring it down. A couple of years and it may get to above crop needs, be what we would call excessive. It may take 15, 20 years for that to be mined out by the crops. So don't let it get at that high at the beginning. There's a lot of different attitudes, and I know we'll hear that from later on about farmers, whether they want to adopt. We have, in Arkansas, some farmers will adopt certain methods and not others. A lot of it depends on the county agent who's trusted within that county, and farmers will listen to some people and perhaps not others. And so it's a message, and a lot of times it's a messenger. But there is a lot of difference out there. And so these are all different drivers. There is the soil processes, the hydrology processes, there's the conservation effectiveness, and I'll show you some of these and how that enters into some of these legacies. And the system response. We are now knowing that watersheds are kind of living entities, and that you can't change something and expect a end product or a goal to be achieved overnight. It just doesn't work like that. Looking at hydrology here, we've got a wide variety from 1 year to several 20 years of transport pathways for that nutrient to get from the field to a water body or stream of concern. So if you're in one of those areas, it would take some cases that length of time to see that response. We need to be aware of that. So just not to belabor the point, I know we're in the area for Lake Erie, but this is work that Dave Baker and Pete Richards, and I just wanted to touch on this because I think it's a good case study or example of what has happened and what we are seeing, how complex this process is. I had the good fortune again to work with another physicist, chemist, Helen Jarvie, and she did some analysis of Pete Richards and Heidelberg's database. What we found was that there's a good relationship here between the flow and the loss of total and phosphorus before and after this critical point where it started to increase. And when you look at the dissolved phosphorus, this relationship is quite different. So something happened around 2000, 2002, that area, where this relationship between flow and phosphorus changed for dissolved and total on the same flow conditions. So something happened. And I don't want to really go into details because I'm sure everybody here kind of has an understanding of what that is. And so I think some of the drivers just basically here that caused that there was a certain, in some cases, a buildup of Sol P because implementation of things like conservation tillage without changing the nutrient management and not injecting or still broadcasting left some of that phosphorus on the surface to be removed. This isn't knocking conservation tillage in any way. Any practice that a farmer will implement, a conservation practice, that's a bonus. That is a step in the right direction. But we need to understand that if you're not incorporating that in the soil, it's there at the surface, and runoff can move it. And so looking at some ways of maintaining that no-till philosophy, but actually getting some of those nutrients into the ground. Tile drainage, we know there's a lot of tile drains being put in. Again, it's a benefit, it's an economic decision, but they connect fields to streams now, so they're basically increasing this critical source area. Fields that didn't have tiles, there was a large soil matrix that nutrient moved through, a lot of sites for absorption. We're bypassing a lot of those. We've got a direct pipe now from that field to that creek. So the downside is that we're increasing flashiness, we're increasing to a certain extent some of that potential for nutrient or phosphorus to be lost. And like I mentioned before, Doug Smith and others have shown it doesn't take a lot to get transported. We did a lot of work in New Zealand a long time ago, shows that there is phosphorus coming out in tiles, but it comes out very quickly. Unless you've got some sampling equipment like Kevin King does, where you've got auto samplers that you can sample during that event, you might miss some of those nutrients, so you may underestimate how much is coming from some tiles. Annual rainfall, we know that there's climate fluctuations. One of the things that happened here that was, again, changing this idea that the soluble phosphorus kicked up differently than the total phosphorus, that there was an increase in intensity of rainfall or amounts of rainfall. The annual amounts didn't change, but when it happened, and the intensity was at times when that land may be more vulnerable to loss. And so one of the things I think we've learned from this, and this is the bottom line, I think, there's a lot of different factors driving this, but we as researchers come up with a lot of good ideas as how to address this. And probably every one of those, there's a reason why a farmer perhaps wouldn't implement and adopt that. And so one, I think, of the important take-home messages here that we as researchers need to live in the real world of where farmers are, and that our recommendations need to be made in some sort of concert or connection with those producers. And in doing that, we have developed a program. It's not ours, uniquely ours. Wisconsin started this about 15 years ago, the Discovery Farm program. We've had it going for, we've had it going now for about 8 years. And I'm just going to briefly touch on what we found to give you a flavor of this translating science, translating what I've just talked about to farmers and what effect it might have had. So it addresses local problems, local water quality issues. It resonates more with farmers, at least for us, if that water is going into Oklahoma and then they're going to sue us because it's coming over. That resonates more than a hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico, which is a long way away. They relate to local issues, and we find that can drive change, or at least some acknowledgement of being part of the solution. And you'll see there at the bottom a lot of different people that are involved, or agencies. The soybean, cotton, Farm Bureau were instrumental in this program in opening the doors of farmers to us as researchers that were they're very skeptical of us to begin with. So there's a lot. This is not just a University or of Arkansas program. It is a team program. It is all those people there combined. And so what it's doing is on-field research, monitoring, and demonstration. And I think the demonstration is the important one. I'm probably closer to, well, it's not probably, I'm closer to the end of my career than the beginning of my career. So this is a program that works for me, but it's not going to work for everybody, partly because it isn't black and white. We can't do cause and effect research. We work with farmers and what conservation practices they're implementing, and they may change 1 year to the next because of market prices or something that's driven. So this is more of a long-term evaluation, a long-term watching of what happens. We do get a lot of buy-in from farmers to implement conservation, but it's not for everybody. We're trying to change this, and I know Warren's at the back there, Dick, that looking at publications and publication outlets that will take this type of research that we probably couldn't statistically validate. It shows important trends, it shows important movement and effects, but it's statistically difficult to validate. And that should not, I think, preclude it being published in some outlet. One of the things that we, at least our university, and this is sure, every university, is that sound science will drive change, and that as long as our faculty promote sound science, there's support. But also, the farmers recognize that if it is sound, and it is good science, then they are more willing to accept those findings. And it's promoting conservation and trying to document conservation effectiveness. And I'll touch on that a little bit right at the end. I think that's critical. So these are the farms. We started off with a couple. Farm Bureau wanted us to get 12. We said, no way, that's too many. And we're now at 13 with a couple of people. It's myself, Mike Daniels at Extension, so in Little Rock. So we kind of share the responsibilities, but we've got a wide range of farms. And this is one of the, I think, one of the challenges that we had when we first got this, because Wisconsin basically had dairy, Minnesota have a similar program. They basically got soybean, but we had this very diverse agriculture, which is one of the benefits, I think, of Arkansas agriculture, but it is basically trying to get somebody to help support or fund this program. Once we got one to support it, then we started to get more. But originally it was, well, we'll let somebody else do it. But we've got a diversity. In the northwest part where I am located, we have, as I say, chicken broiler production is a major, it's the second in the country, I think, to Georgia. And then we've got row crop agriculture, rice, soybean, cotton, and corn in what we call the Delta. So it's very diverse. So, but I just want to focus on two farms briefly, just to show you, give you a flavor of what the benefits and outcomes we have found from this program. This is a farm, it is the Moore farm. There we go. Poultry, row crop. He does have a couple of acres of row crop, 200 corn, wheat. But he's got 200 broilers, and those are like 4 houses at the top of those were the original houses, and they had 4 at the bottom which were wiped out during an ice storm. They collapsed. They were hen houses, and the youngest son decided to come back and be part of that farm group, and so they put in 4 new ones at the lower ones there. And we were looking to find somebody, and the Walton Family Foundation supported this, were part of supporting this research, or this program here, find somebody that were in the process of building, and could we work with them to try and reduce the footprint, or the nutrient, or the environmental footprint, however you want to call it. And so this really was a great opportunity. We were able to work with them. Again, this family is very active in Farm Bureau, and they were helping get this process going. So one of the things they did, it was just looking at it and working with them. We put a berm in. The slope, you construct these houses, you dig out an area to put the bedding and the footing in, but it's done by a contractor. So they cut into a hill slope and created some pretty steep slopes. That's nobody's fault, but it just one person comes along, does one thing, then somebody else comes and does something, because the next process. But it's obvious that if you can stop runoff running down that hill and washing through those houses, you're not going to remove as much nutrients from them. This was probably instigated by, in Chesapeake Bay, there was an issue called fan and feathers. And there was a couple of poultry operations that were sued by EPA because of the emissions from the fans and the spillage of litter as they were harvesting birds or cleaning out that litter. It's not something that's deliberate, it's part of doing business, it happens. And farmers trying to minimize it, but you can't. You contract out somebody to clean those houses. They're going to get it done as quickly and efficiently as possible. Spilling a little bit of litter is no concern to them. And so it's left then at the end of the day with the farmer. And so there are areas, hotspots around these houses that that EPA were looking at. You can go and see it. And if you see a little bit of litter outside that door of that poultry house, then it's a problem to EPA. And so it got their attention, and spot checking from EPA Region 6 got their attention. And again, there was nothing actually done, but the inspections got the attention of these farmers, and hearing what was happening in the Chesapeake Bay, that they decided this is a bigger issue to them than the land application on fields, because that is mandated by other environmentally sound methods, procedures. So, simple, put a berm, stop water, divert it around the backside of those houses. First one. We then put in a flume and ISCO samplers at several locations, one where we're looking at runoff coming from the pasture and a little bit of row crop, and from the backside of those poultry houses, where what we call the tunnel vents, the fans are, they're blowing dust out. That has a large amount of nutrients in it. It gets deposited at the backside of those houses. And also looking at here, the runoff from in the front of these. And since we got there when they were building this, we were able to put a camber in that road between these two houses. And I'll show you a little bit in a minute. But we're able to divert the water from the top ones, which are the old, from the bottom ones, which are the new, and looking at what were the differences. And one of the main differences that we did do, you can probably make it out, but I'll show you, we put a concrete pad in front of the doors so that a farmer could clean and maintain that area after clean out, and it makes life a lot easier. And so those are the monitoring sites. This is the original, most of the houses like this. It's how they're constructed. But if you spill a little bit of litter in front of the doors up here, never mind, you can't really, farmer can't push that back into the house. It's going to have gravel and grit in it. That's not going to work. Those birds need a safe environment. And so it's just left. And so this is what we did. It's probably about $2,000, which the program paid for in this case, but we know what it costs. And so in time, we'll be able to do a cost reduction efficiency of what was the efficiency and how much was invested in doing this, was it in effect in reducing nutrient runoff. One of the things that they found from these farmers, that actually the people that were bringing in the birds or the feed, probably the feed comes in every couple of days, found this a lot better because they could turn around their big trucks without getting stuck. So there were side benefits to having this pad there. So what have we found? Oh, we've been there now since the last 3 years on this farm. And those here, I'm just showing you, if it's below that line, then there was more coming from the new house than the old houses. And this is in 16 and 17. So we can see over time, as these, some of the ditches that were created and they got more grass established, but over time, we're getting much less phosphorus and nitrogen coming off the new than the old houses. Even the flow, surprisingly, although you got more impervious areas, is a little low, is less coming off the new than the old. So this is the type of data that we're getting from this program. And these are the average mean annual losses in pounds per acre. It's nearly about half of what's coming off those old houses. So this is the type of information that allows farmers to go into a conversation with a point source to say, look, this is the amounts of what I'm remediating or not putting into that creek. It gives them that they don't, before that, non-point, because it's diffuse, is so difficult to quantify, and therefore for them to say, this is what I've been able to do. And I want to go now, the last one here is a cotton farmer. There's less and less acres of cotton. He kept a couple of fields in cotton because we wanted to continue this program. Steve Stevens' farm, good example. Mike Daniels and I went down to talk to him to see if he was interested. The county agent said, this guy's going to, he'd be a good one to work with. Nothing to do. We had lunch like you do in the coffee shop. Nothing to do with it. I don't want you to be involved with my farm because I know what's going to happen. EPA is going to come knocking on my door as soon as we start getting information. And so we thought, oh, okay. So again, the county agent continued to have a discussion, and I think he probably saw some of the other farms that we were working on. And eventually he came around and allowed us to, at least Mike in this case, because it's in the southern part of the state, to set up some monitoring. The interesting fact is that he is now the most strongest and vocal advocate of the program and wants more information and wants his losses to be lower than what they're coming, even though we think they are low to start with. So he transitioned from being, I don't want to have anything to do with it, to being a strong advocate. Again, that's one person, but it highlights, I think, some change in philosophy that's brought about. And it's certainly not Mike or I's doing. It's just how he's being felt part of that program. And so this is part of his fields here. This is just pictures that were taken after 3.5-inch rain on no-till and again, he took these pictures and just to show what the differences were from no-till. And again, one picture tells us that is better than 1,000 words. And so this is the type of information, again, that's important to him. And so what have we found? Looking at here again, over time, these losses have decreased from looking at 8 pounds per acre down to less than 1 nitrogen, and the phosphorus is just about 1 down to less than about 0.3 pounds per acre. These are averages from his fields. One important point here is these conservation practices work, but the fact is that they're getting better each year, and that's an important thing that we need to remember. These conservation practices don't always work immediately. They need time to bed in for that effectiveness to get more and more, to reach, so that it takes time for them to reach their maximum effectiveness. And so I think one of the major findings from this program have been that conservation practices do actually decrease runoff. Again, that's not rocket science, but it's important to farmers in our state to be able to know and see what they have done. We also see that a couple of storms in 1 year, very wet, drive losses, and I'm sure that's the same everywhere. And it's really important, and farmers have told us, we need to do this on my farm for 5 to 6 years. Don't do it for a couple of years because I know that information may not be reliable. We need a dry year, wet year, totally different. So this is basically showing that, that 1 or 2 storms, and the question then becomes, do you try and manage for those storms, or do you try and manage for the 80% of the others? And that's a good question. It's a debate that's still out there. I think to a certain extent, we've got to be realistic that there are some storms we just cannot manage for. In Arkansas, they call them toad stranglers. There's a lot of variability from year to year. Again, I think there's a lot of variability from site to site, and that's got to be important. That's a trade-off. That's got to be recognized with a lot of these conservation practices. And one of the important things I think we found, we never realized when we went into this, but there was some work done with World Resources Institute out of DC about looking at putting in a nutrient trading program in the Mississippi River Basin, huge basin. But they wanted just a feasibility study, and they used some modeling to look at how much is coming off. And what we're finding is what the model was predicting is a lot more than what we're finding from these real world what we think of as real-world private farms. And so these are the predicted losses. Based on those predicted losses, they had an eligibility standard for the nutrient trading program, or at least this proposed trading program of you need to be at 13.4 to get below that. You need to be above that to be eligible, so you can then draw those losses down. What we were seeing was, on average, most of the runoff coming off of these fields was below that eligibility. Whether that's, this is not saying the models are not working, they're not right, or they're not of value, they are. But the disconnect is that there is differences, and if this had been enacted, then most of the farmers that we have wouldn't be eligible to be part of this program because their losses are already below what that threshold was. Maybe it's because they already implemented conservation practices without anybody's help. They did it because they wanted to. They didn't work with NLCS. So that's an important message I think we need to take home, repeating those. But I think we need to keep that in mind, and what we're finding, and it's not just us, when we talk amongst our colleagues, I think we find that what we're seeing from these farms are probably not as much as what we would have expected. And that's not going to be the case in every field, but that was something that's important. So you need to have some realistic goals and realistic achievements. And so I think in closing here, just show some of the farmers that we've worked with and some of the state senators and congressmen that we brought out. Obviously we want to promote it and we want to get them, they like to be out there, they like to touch and shake hands with farmers. Mike and I had the experience of going to state capitol to talk about the program. We took a couple of farmers along with us, and one or two of the senators said, well, that was really interesting, but I'm glad you brought a real person with you. So they listen to farmers, and so I think the key point here is this empowerment, and I think that's something we've learned over time, that by giving this information that we're empowering some farmers, not everybody, but we try to work with those farmers that will influence others. And so the challenges, just quickly here, the challenges I think, I'm not sure about Ohio, but Arkansas has a very liberal freedom of information. If you get a sample and you are using state funds and you analyze it, that information is freely available. If somebody wants to get it, they can get it. And so there's a rush to judgment. We're working on a few farms which are under pressure, and there is the propensity to collect some data where we're using information, 1 or 2 points that's not, it's taken out of context or out of context of local realities. So that is a challenge that we've got to realize. It's something that we shouldn't not do this program because of, but we need to be aware of it. I think the opportunities are that we are fostering support amongst our stakeholders, and it allows a broader network of stakeholder support and also adoption of programs. And lastly, the one that I showed you, that last farm, the idea that data begets more data. Once the farmer got some information, he wanted more, and he was pushing. I'm glad that farm was down in the southern state because he was pushing Mike, not me, but he wanted his losses lower than what they were. So give them a bit of data. In our experience, they want more. And so with that, I thank you for the opportunity to be here. Thank you.